where it's at. Yay. And then just come right back here in 15 minutes so that we can talk about what we learned. I am presenting good. Then I want to present this to you. So just go to Schoology, no, actually go to the calendar. And I want you to look at that Arab-Israeli conflict by crash course. Not the top one, the second one, Arab-Israeli conflict by crash course.
This is Crash Course.
I don't know if you guys have you guys done the crash courses before? Have you seen them? Yeah, okay. So I love the info that they give. Here's the problem. I love it because I already know this stuff. And as he talks, I go, If you've never heard this info before, then he's talking a mile a minute. And you're like, wait, what? Does that make sense too? Okay, good. So we'll give this a shot. We'll see how it goes. This is why we're watching this, why you get a lecture, and then maybe we'll do another video. You all at home, take 15 minutes, watch this Conflict in Israel and Palestine Crash Course World History. I will see you in 15 minutes. Understand? Okay, good. 15 minutes from now, whatever that is. I'll go 8:37 plus 15. See you in a bit. I'll just keep sharing this, but you know, it could echo and stuff, so. All right, and then you and I, let's do this thing.
Course World History, and today we're going to talk about Israel and Palestine, hopefully without a flame war. Yeah, big ask, Mr. Green. I mean, that fight goes back thousands and thousands of years. Except thousands of years ago, there wasn't an Islam yet. So yeah, no. Also, let me submit that very little of this conflict between Israel and Palestine over the last several decades has been about, like, theological differences between Islam and Judaism. No one's arguing about whether the most important prophets descended from Abraham's son Isaac or his son Ishmael, right? It's not about whether to fast during Yom Kippur or Ramadan. It's about land. Portraying the conflict as eternal or as religious makes it feel intractable in a way that, frankly, it isn't. So instead, let's begin, as most historians do, in the late 19th century. And instead of talking about religion, let's follow the lead of historians like James Galvin and discuss competing nationalisms. Okay, so in the late 19th century, the Ottoman Empire ruled over what we now know as Palestine. The population there, according to Ottoman records from 1878, was 87% Muslim, 10% Christian, and 3% Jewish. Everybody spoke Arabic as the daily language, and in Jerusalem, the religious populations were roughly equal. To give you a sense of life in Ottoman Palestine, an Arab Orthodox Christian musician named Wasif Jaharia grew up in Jerusalem in the first decade of the 20th century, learning the Quran in school and celebrating both Passover and Eid with his Jewish and Muslim neighbors. Ottoman Palestine was, in short, a place in which people of different religious faiths lived peacefully together. All right, let's go to the fun part. The late 19th century was the golden age of nationalism in Europe, and no place was crazier than the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire, in which at least 10 different nations all wanted their own state. And in that hyper-nationalistic empire lived a Jewish journalist named Theodor Herzl, who had hoped that Jews could assimilate into European nations, but soon became convinced that the Jewish people needed to leave Europe and settle in their own state. The concept of Jewish nationalism came to be known as Zionism. It's important to keep in mind that most Zionists were secular Jews, so they imagined Israel as a state for Jews more than a Jewish state. In 1917, the British government, hoping to gain the support of Jewish people, issued the Balfour Declaration, promising, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. A bold promise, considering that Palestine was still technically Ottoman, as they hadn't yet lost World War I. Of course, they would soon, but it turned out that the British were over-promisers when it came to Palestine, because a year before the Balfour Declaration, the British had secretly promised the French that they would divide up the Arab territories and the Brits would keep Palestine. Furthermore, in 1915, other British officials had promised the ruler of Mecca, Sharif Hussein, that he would rule over an Arab state, including Palestine, if he led an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule, which Hussein promptly did. So basically, the Brits had promised Palestine to the Meccans, to themselves, and to the Zionists. What could go wrong? Thanks, Thought Bubble. So shortly after the end of the war, the British established a colony in Palestine with the idea that they'd rule until the Palestinians were ready to govern themselves. At which point the people living in Palestine were like, well, now seems good. And the British were like, yeah, but maybe not just yet. Meanwhile, the British established separate institutions for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, making it difficult for Palestinian Christians and Muslims to cooperate, and easier for the British to, quote, divide and rule the inhabitants of Palestine. Again, what could go wrong? Meanwhile, the British did attempt to honor the Balfour Declaration's promise to, quote, facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions. Between 1920 and 1939, the Jewish population of Palestine increased by over 320,000 people. In fact, by 1938, Jews were just under 30% of the population of Palestine. And the growing Jewish population focused on purchasing land from absentee non-Palestinian Arab landowners and then evicting Palestinian farmers who were living and working there. By controlling both the land and the labor, they hoped to establish a more secure community within Palestine. But of course, these practices heightened tensions between Jewish people and Arab Palestinians during the 1920s and 1930s. Along the way, Palestinian Arabs began to think of themselves as the Palestinian nation, and that growing sense of nationalism erupted in 1936 when the Palestinians revolted against the British. With the help of Jewish militias, the British brutally suppressed the Palestinian revolt, but in the aftermath, the British issued a white paper limiting Jewish immigration to Palestine and called for the establishment of a joint Arab and Jewish state in Palestine within 10 years. This managed to leave no one happy. The Zionists were angry at Britain for limiting Jewish immigration at a time when Jews particularly needed to leave Europe, and the Arab Palestinians were unhappy about the prospect of waiting 10 years for a state. And then came World War II, which was actually quite a peaceful time in Palestine. But then it ended and tensions resumed, and the British realized that colonies like Palestine were far more trouble than they were worth, so they handed the issue of Palestine over to the newly created United Nations. They're like, oh, hey there, United Nations, for your first problem. So in November of 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into separate Palestinian and Jewish states. The partition plan called for two states roughly equal in size, but the borders looked like a jigsaw puzzle. I mean, you do not look at this map and think, yeah, that's going to work. Sure enough, it didn't. And soon after the plan was announced, the cleverly named 1948 Arab-Israeli War broke out with Israel on the one side and the Palestinians and many Arab states on the other. The Israelis won, and when an armistice was signed in 1949, Israel occupied a third more land than they would have had under the UN proposal. Meanwhile, Jordan controlled and later annexed the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem, and Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. Over 700,000 Palestinians fled their homes and became refugees in the surrounding Arab countries. To Israelis, this war was the beginning of their nation. To the Palestinians, it was the Navka, the catastrophe. They became stateless. Over the next 18 years, nothing changed territorially, and then in 1967, Israel and several Arab states went to war again. It was called the 6 Days War because, get this, it lasted 6 days. Israel won and then gained control over the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. So the 1947 proposal looked like this. By 1967, things looked like this. Then the UN passed Resolution 242. Man, they are good at naming resolutions, which outlined a basic framework for achieving peace, including Israel withdrawing from the territory acquired in the war, and all participants recognizing the rights of both a Palestinian and an Israeli state to exist. This, of course, did not happen. After the war, the broader Israeli-Arab conflict morphed into a more specific Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this is a nice moment to note that not all Muslims are Arabs, not all Arabs are Palestinians, and not all Palestinians are Muslims. Like there's a significant Christian minority of Palestinians, for instance. Palestinian is a word used to describe the ethnic identity of those who have historically lived in Palestine. There were, for instance, lots of Christians in the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, formed in 1964 and led by Yasser Arafat. The PLO oversaw guerrilla groups that attacked civilians, but also used nonviolent approaches to try to achieve a Palestinian state. And meanwhile, the Israeli government began to establish Jewish settlements in what had been Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. There are now over 350,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank and over 200,000 in East Jerusalem. And these settlements are illegal according to international law, but Israel counters by saying that they are really illegal because Palestine isn't really a state. By the late 1980s, Palestinians launched the first Intifada, which literally means shaking off. And this began with like boycotts of Israeli products and services and refusing to pay Israeli taxes. But when the Israeli armed forces cracked down on protesters, violence ensued. And the first Intifada also saw the founding of Hamas, which launched the first suicide bombing against Israel in 1993. Hamas gained support partly because of its militancy, but mostly because of its social welfare projects in Gaza. It built and staffed schools, mosques, and clinics. The most important legacy of the first Intifada was the emergence of peace talks between Palestinians and Israelis. This led process based on our old friend United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. But there were a lot of issues to resolve. I mean, putting aside the question of like how to make two states that don't look like a jigsaw puzzle, there is the question of the Jewish settlement and the right for Palestinian refugees and their descendants to return to Palestine, water rights, which are a big deal in that part of the world, and so on. It's very complicated. So then came the Clinton talk. So it's time for the open letter. But first, let's see what's inside of the globe. Oh, look, it's a collection of philandering American presidents. An open letter to Bill Clinton. Hey, Bill, so your talks probably came closer than any other time in recent history to an actual peace deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians. Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak was willing to give up more land currently claimed by Israel than at any time in the past. Even Yasser Arafat was surprised. Although not all the questions got addressed, you were definitely closing in on something. But in the end, it didn't happen. And since then, not to criticize you, things have gotten kind of worse and worse and worse. Worst of all, that was your big legacy moment. Now all you've got is the conflict in Northern Ireland getting resolved while you were president. In short, it could have been amazing, but instead it was kind of kind of like your presidency, actually. At least you always have those vodka SoCos with Boris Yeltsin to look back on. Best wishes, John Green. So the Clinton talks failed, Ehud Barak's government was undermined, and then in September of 2000, Prime Minister candidate Ariel Sharon led a group of 1,000 armed guards to the Temple Mount in the Old City of Jerusalem. To Muslims, this is known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it's the third holiest site in Islam, behind only the Kaaba in Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. And it's the holiest site in Judaism, so in short, it's a pretty touchy place to march to with 1,000 armed guards. So the event sparked a massive protest, which eventually led to the much more violent Second Intifada, in which more than 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were eventually killed. In 2002, the Israelis, claiming to act in defense of civilians, began construction of a wall around the West Bank. But instead of following the borders established after the 1967 war, the barrier was built to include many Israeli settlements on the Israeli side. To Israelis, that was about self-defense. To Palestinians, it was an illegal land grab. Then in 2005, Yasser Arafat died, and in an election shortly thereafter, Hamas won a majority of the parliamentary seats. Since then, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have sort of divided how to govern Palestine, and it's also sort of been poorly governed. In the past 10 years, Hamas has frequently launched rocket attacks into Israel. Israel has responded with extended and extremely violent invasions of Palestinian territory that have seen thousands of Palestinians killed, many of them militants, but also many not. Both parties claim to be responding to the provocations of the other, but much of the conflict reflects a consistent failure on all sides to understand the legitimacy of the other's narrative. To Palestine, the Palestinian people have been denied a state not just since the formation of Israel, but also for decades before that. And now they live under what amounts to a military occupation. And that's all true. To Israel, the Jewish people clearly need a homeland, which the United Nations established. And they certainly aren't the first nation state to consolidate and increase their territory by a military victory. And they need to protect their nation against the many active threats made against them by their neighbors. That's also true. It's important to understand the internal logic of these competing nationalist visions. For both Zionist and Palestinian national visions to eventually work, it's necessary to understand the right of each to exist and the legitimacy of each's historical narrative. But these problems aren't thousands of years old, and they aren't intractable. They emerged in the British Mandatory period. But let's hope that by understanding that this isn't an endless religious war, that we might be closer to seeing its end. Thanks for watching. Crash Course is coming here in the chat.
All right. Back to these guys. I'll stop presenting for just a minute. Whoop. Okay, that was a ton of info. You got 25, 26, and 27. What, if anything, did you get for 25? Historical background to this conflict. And you guys at home, please, please, please feel like you can chime in as well. Have anything at all? Here's what we got.
I said it was about land, not religion.
Yeah, that's super, super important. That maybe is the most important thing that you should know. Is it's about land, and not arguing over religion. Where could you put that in? Is that number 25?
Yeah.
Okay. General info is it's definitely about land, and it's not so much about religion. There's a It's an extremely small area, actually, and it's actually surprising how small it is, and that these 2 or 3 competing sides are trying to have a claim, a historical claim to their land, to that exact same land, and that's the root of the problem. It turns out though that ethnically or religiously there are 2 different sides, right? But just in general, it's all about land. I like that. Something else? Who controlled the land a long time ago? Yeah, the Ottoman Empire. For a long time, the Ottoman Empire was the overruler or overlord of that area. And then, once the Ottoman Empire fell apart, yeah, the British. Here's something that I think is really interesting. So the British go all over the world, taking over all of these different places. In the mid 1940s, or like 1947, 1948, the British are giving up 2 different places that get partitioned by different kinds of people, right? Last week we talked about India and Pakistan, and this week we're talking about Israel and Palestine. The British are the people who are controlling. The British are decolonizing. They're getting out after World War II because they can't afford it, et cetera, et cetera. They don't want to keep these people as part of their empire or under their control. And once that overruler, once the person who's, or the people who are keeping control over everything, then you get different sides saying, we want this state, we want that state, we're like this, we're this religion or we're this ethnic group, and others saying there's something different. And then, as you know, all hell breaks loose. You get a million people in India dying, or you get all these Arab-Israeli wars breaking up. Okay. Anything about the wars? Did you get any specifics about the wars? We ask people at home. You guys at home have anything? Did you learn anything from the video about the different wars? There's a whole bunch of different sort of simple questions to ask, like how many wars, who wins the wars, what happens as a result of the wars, and those sorts of things. Any of the wars particularly important or less important? Have anything going there?
Is this 6-Day War?
Yeah, the 6-Day War was important. What happens there?
I forget which side, but one side sort of comes out on top.
Yep.
Pretty fast, obviously.
Yeah. Most of these wars are really pretty short.
Yeah.
It's like I said, it's a super small area, and for whatever reason, it's just a really short war. That 6-Day War is in 1967, and one side does come out on top, or one side really does win, and we know they win because
they take the land.
They take the land, right? Yeah. Okay. And then anything about peace in the Middle East? You guys hear anything about that? Yeah, some of the land gets traded back then. If the Israelis are taking over land, sometimes in these peace deals, they give up some of the land, or they make moves towards what the Palestinians want, which would be, what do the Palestinians want? Their own state, yeah. And so maybe making some moves towards that. Okay, good. You guys at home didn't say anything? I get that, that's okay. Let me present to you then, let me give you the lecture. Hopefully I back up what the guy in the video said. Hopefully we get through all of the EQs that we need. I only have like 3 or 4 slides, I think, or 2 slides. We'll see here. Okay. Yeah. So it's the United Nations really in 1947, 48 that creates Israel. They are something new after World War II. I'm sorry that we don't have an EQ about the UN. I'll talk to my colleagues about that. We probably need to add something. It is sometimes ineffective, but it's a really important international organization. The United Nations more or less creates an Israel and a Palestine, or that's their plan. They want to partition this territory because the British are just giving up, and so the United Nations tries to work that out. Israel then is created, I think it's May 1948, and right away you had the first Arab-Israeli war. The Arabs don't like the formation of an Israel as an independent state. They don't like that this area was partitioned more or less 50-50. And so a whole coalition of Arab states get together to attack the new Israel. You should probably write that down for 26. There are, we'll count 4 Arab-Israeli wars. The 1948 war is the first one. They're all pretty much the same, which is really nice for us. In all 4 Arab-Israeli wars, you have multiple Arab states attacking, well, I don't want to say that, going to war with Israel. And every single Arab-Israeli war ends up with an Israeli victory. Israel always wins the Arab-Israeli wars. There's a number of reasons for that, such as the equipment that's being used. But I think what it comes down to is if Israel loses a war against the Arab states, Israel's wiped off the map, and maybe you have another, genocide happen. And so the Israelis fight really, really tooth and nail hard to win those wars. If the Arabs lose, okay, well, like you're an Egyptian soldier, you just go back to Egypt, or if you're a Syrian soldier, you just go back to Syria. It's not that deadly of a fight for you. Anyway, 1948. I think the thing that you need to know for 1948, the 1948 war, is that 700,000 Palestinians were moved or were forced to move because of that 1948 war. There is, he called it the catastrophe or the Nabka. I think that's Nabka. Lots and lots of Palestinians, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians move away from their homes and they more or less go to the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Some of them end up in other refugee camps elsewhere, but that's kind of the big deal with the 1948 war. Palestinians move. 1956 you can ignore, more or less. It's another coalition of Arab states attacking Israel, and Israel wins. That's pretty much it. 1967, as Jonah reminded us, is a very important 6-day war in which Israel wins big. They actually attacked first in 1967 because they knew or thought the Arab states were about to attack them. So they do a sneak attack, seize a whole bunch of territory, take over really all that stuff that you see there, and much, much more, including parts of Egypt. So 1967 is the biggest Israeli victory, biggest land grab that happens. 73 is called the Yom Kippur War, and that's when the Arabs sneak attack Israel on their holiest day, when they're not expecting an attack, and Israel comes closest, I think, to losing that war before pushing the Arabs back and winning. Long story short, for number 26, 2 sides, obviously Arabs and Israelis, but the Arab side, what do we need to know there? Always lose, and it's a coalition. It's multiple states. It's a whole bunch of different states. The coalition changes from time to time depending on the war, but it's always several Arab states coming together to try to take on the Israelis. The Israelis are always outnumbered. In spite of that, they always win. And the result of that, well, the cause is land, and the result is land. Cause is, Arabs and Israelis fighting over the same land, and the result is always the Israelis are winning and seizing land that sometimes they deal back for peace. Like I said, the Palestinians flee or are forced to settle in the Gaza Strip or West Bank. That starts in 1948. Israel and Palestine have a continuing violent. Israel and Palestine have continuing violent problem today. Last week, there were rockets flying from the Gaza Strip into Israel. There are Israel airstrikes in Gaza. This kind of thing. That thing was done in 2015. That video was 2015, and it's fresh as can be. Ongoing violence, really quite frequent violence. The Palestinians, like I say, they live in the Gaza Strip. I think there's about 1 million people crammed in the Gaza Strip. There are a few million Palestinian people also in the West Bank. They want a state and in order to get their state, sometimes they negotiate and sometimes they revolt. You might want to write down intifada somewhere. That is an uprising by people in Gaza or people in the West Bank. They're always rising up, not always. Sometimes they rise up in order to protest not having a state. They protest being under the control of the Israelis. They protest just the treatment by the Israelis of Palestinian people. And the Israelis respond with incursions or invasions of those territories, trying to put those revolts down. They also, you can see there, it's terrorism too. The Palestinians try terrorism from time to time, going way, way back, and sometimes just really terrible things. Sometimes it's as simple as a Palestinian person drives their car into a crowd of Israelis in Israel, or sometimes it's a stabbing of people on the street in Israel, or sometimes it's the blowing up of a bus in Israel, or sometimes it's the murder of Israeli athletes at the Olympics. There's just all kinds of different Palestinian terror attacks that have happened over decades, and Israel's freaked out about that. They try to protect themselves in various ways. Like I said, with these incursions into the Gaza Strip or into the West Bank, for example. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, is the organization that represents the Palestinians. They're the ones who, in number 27, are trying to work out peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Two successes that I want you to know about for peace in the Middle East. One is called the Camp David Accords. There it is, 1978. Camp David is where our American presidents have their cabin, so to speak. That's where they go on vacation. And the Egyptian leader and the Israeli leader came, and President Carter worked out peace between Egypt and Israel. This was a huge deal. This is the first crack in that Arab coalition. You know, the Arabs always attacking Israel. After this, then it becomes much more difficult for all the Arab states to get together. So Egypt and Israel have peace, and Egypt gets this big chunk of territory, the Sinai Peninsula, back from the Israelis that the Israelis won in the '67 war. Sadly, the ruler of Egypt was assassinated a few years later because he made peace with Israel. It's not the last time that a Israeli or Arab politician has been assassinated because they're friendly towards the other side. It's kind of like what happened to Gandhi in a way. 1993, what the guy in the video was talking about were the Oslo Peace Accords, which gave Gaza and the West Bank some autonomy, like on the way to becoming a nation. Let the Palestinians have a little bit of power over their own territories, let them regulate some things. And that was a notable success too, but it hasn't led yet to a Palestinian state. I'd say the Camp David Accords are the most successful thing that happened. The Oslo Peace Accords are less successful, and then there's other attempts, like he was talking about, where just nothing happens. Israel continues to build settlements in the West Bank. They build these really nice subdivisions, these really nice neighborhoods for Israeli people, and then they want to protect them from the Palestinians, and so they build a giant wall, or they have built a giant wall that separates Palestinians from Israelis. I'll show you a picture of that in just a second. It's really pretty crazy. It's like what we had during the Cold War in Berlin, if not more. And it's to keep Palestinians and Israelis separate because, like I said, the Palestinians sometimes go to Israel and commit acts of violence. And what it ends up looking like is a super nice subdivision, gigantic wall, and on the other side of the wall, it's like the third world. It's really pretty extreme and sad. Israel continues to treat the Palestinians poorly, even Arab Palestinians who are Israeli citizens. That's a huge thing. There's a million or more Israelis who are Palestinian, who are Arab, who are Muslim, they're kind of second-class citizens, and they're not happy under in Israel as second-class citizens. Like I said, Palestinians sometimes attack settlers, or they attack people in Israel, or they rise up, they protest, they're trying to get their own state, and that's kind of just the situation that we have. Anything else? I don't know. I'm like the same guy. I'm like the guy in the video. I'm talking a mile a minute too. I think I'm done. Do you want any extra info, or do you have any questions or comments? Nope. Okay. You guys at home, do you have any questions or comments? Oh, I wanted to show you these images real quick. So that guy there at the bottom is Yasser Arafat. He was the longtime leader of the PLO, either, you know, diplomat, politician, or terrorist, depending on how you define him. There's Jimmy Carter with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin at those Camp David Accords. The thing on the bottom right is just sort of an example of the Intifada, the rising up of Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank, with Israeli people coming in and sort of hitting them with the batons or shooting at them and stuff like that. Left and right at the top. Left at the top is kind of a showing you what the border looks like, with barbed wire and surveillance and military patrols. I should have had a giant wall there for you to see as well. There's literally a gigantic wall between a lot of places. And check out on the right. See how weird you see the red line, if it's red, that goes all around in different parts. That's the wall too. That's the border and the wall. It's just designed to protect Israeli people in those nice subdivisions from Palestinian people. It cuts Palestinian people off from each other, cuts Palestinian farmers off from their farmland. It's really pretty crazy and really not very nice, but I get it. They feel threatened. So there's kind of that. And those settlements keep creeping, and there's more and more people taking over that territory of the West Bank, and it really rankles Palestinians quite a bit. In Jerusalem, the same kind of thing. There's Israeli people taking over Palestinian people's neighborhoods and not allowing them to renovate their houses or stuff like that. It's a very intractable problem. Questions for me? All right. Try the U12P5 Middle East decolonization lecture check. I tried to make the questions pretty simple for a conflict that is really pretty difficult. You guys at home do the same thing. U5 at U12P5. Those of you at home, if you have finished the U-12P5 decolonization in the Middle East, lecture check, I'm going to let you go here in just a second. I do want to let you know that I want all of the retakes, all of the late assignments or whatever you're turning into me, but especially all of the summative retakes done by Friday. Get those done by Friday. After Friday, during finals week, starting on Tuesday, we're done. That could be really dangerous for some of you if you haven't taken a test or if you took a test and bombed it, and it has to be done Friday 3:30, and that's that. So let me know if you need to do a retake, and maybe we can work something out. But has to get done so that I can get all that cleared, and we're done with that. So have a nice day. I'll see you tomorrow. I think we're doing synchronous pretty much all this week. So see you tomorrow. Do you guys hear that too? If you have a retake, if you haven't done a test, if there's something summative, it could be the DBQ essay, it could be the historical figures project. I need you to get those things done by Friday 3:30. Nothing in finals week. We're just done with everything before finals and finals week. And that should be that. Did it seem like the questions were okay on the quiz? There wasn't anything weird, like I didn't have the wrong answer. Poland attacked Israel or something. Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens this week. Last week, there was a ceasefire between the Gaza Strip, with the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and Israel. Hopefully it holds. Maybe they can work some sort of peace thing out someday. It's really pretty sad. Tyler, I'm gonna shut things down. You have any questions or anything? I'm gonna talk about the Harlem Globetrotters and the Washington Generals. All right, I'll see you later.